The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
CJ, it's been a tough week in the National Hockey League. We lost two prominent members. Ray Shero, the longtime NHL exec, Stanley Cup champion, obviously through his work with the Pittsburgh Penguins. We lost him on Wednesday. Greg Millen, longtime NHLer, longtime broadcaster, passing away earlier this week as well. A lot of support pouring out from various members of the NHL community. You've written some really good pieces on both of them in the last little while. Just a tough time. I don't have a straightforward question, but I can imagine you're feeling a little bit emotional over these two recent deaths.
Yeah, I think you're reminded at a time like this. I mean, you see this saying all the time, or you hear it, the hockey world, right? Like this idea that everyone's under one world. When I think of it, it's actually more like a hockey banquet hall, because you could probably fit most people into something much smaller than a world. And so when you go through two things like this, where you have families, obviously, dealing with frankly, tragic deaths. I mean, young men, Greg Millen was 67, Ray Shero was 62. Their deaths, at least to the public, were not something that I think there was any way to anticipate. And so, it hits doubly hard, because they almost come a little bit out of the blue again for the average person. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of people that would know Greg, as I did, I worked with him for years at Sportsnet. And I know you did as well, worked alongside him as a media colleague, would know Ray really well too, because you couldn't go too far in the hockey world without, crossing Ray Shero. And really, when you look at him and his family, I mean, this is a guy who lived a lifetime in hockey, from his dad, Fred the Fog Shero, who's in the Hockey Hall of Fame, to some of his closest friends. Jarmo Kekalainen was a very good friend of Ray Shero. David Poyle was a mentor to Ray. He worked in Nashville before he got the head job in Pittsburgh. You branch out to people his same age. I mean, he was a GM for as long as he was. There's a lot of overlap in the feelings I think a lot of people have. And so, I don't have a straightforward answer, and you didn't have a straightforward question, because I think, a little bit your brain goes in all directions here. But obviously sorry that both men are gone, that, gone too soon, I would say too. And, a lot of people can't help but feel some hurt from that, because, you look for sense sometimes, I think, at a time like this, and I'm not sure there's a lot of sense to be found in either case.
Can you go into more detail about what it was like interacting with Ray Shero as a media member, particularly when he was still a general manager for a handful of NHL teams?
Yeah, I'm trying to think when I first would have met Ray, but obviously it would have been somewhere early in my career. He worked in Pittsburgh with the Penguins since 2006. And, by about that time, I was coming on the scene in terms of covering the league, covered both the Stanley Cup Finals, 2008 and 2009, that his Penguins played in. And was just always really upbeat, infectious kind of guy. I never didn't have any run-ins with him, or any issues like that. Like, he wasn't particularly confrontational, was, from what I can think of, was pretty receptive in terms of working with the media. I remember there was a year, I wish some of the years get kind of blended in my mind, but I was covering the World Hockey Championship, and there started to be rumblings that Jaromir Jagr was going to come back to the NHL. And I recall, I believe that was in Slovakia, so that would make it 2011, if I've got it right, dealing with Ray about that, because at the time the Penguins, were looking to try to bring Jagr back into the fold. Ultimately, actually went and signed in Philadelphia and started that sort of meandering second journey he had through the NHL. But yeah, I mean, really, Ray he was the kind of guy you were happy to bump into, because, he'd usually have a funny line or a funny story for you, maybe an off-color kind of, just what the hell's going on, but something worse than hell, like he'd kind of make you laugh with the way he might greet you. And then, was always a very welcoming face. So, I haven't heard anyone really say anything negative about him. And I'm not just saying, because of his untimely death. I mean, we're talking about someone who for a long time had to deal with media members and agents and, his fellow front offices around the league. And I think he was someone who commanded a lot of respect. And part of that, again, I can't underline it enough. I mean, he literally grew up with the Philadelphia Flyers in the 70s. His dad was the coach, and had him around the teams that won the back-to-back cups in 74 and 75. We got to see the inner workings of an NHL team at that age when he was, going through his adolescence into his teenage years. Went to St. Lawrence College as a player and was drafted by the LA Kings actually in 1982, but then immediately jumped into being an agent after he graduated. It was as though he knew his future was off the ice rather than trying to pursue a professional playing career. And, after that 7 years in the agent business, he worked over 3 decades consecutively for NHL teams, so someone who spent that much time around the game obviously is doing something right, both in their ability to identify talent, the way they run an organization, the decisions they make that they get judged on. And, the big part of that, I think, is the way you relate to people. And when I think of Ray Shero, that's how I think of him, as someone who was very relatable, welcoming, and, just really well liked, which when you get to the end of your life, the second line in his obituary is saying, he helped win a Stanley Cup. But I think what's probably more important is he left this world as someone who made a huge impression on people and was really well liked.
That's really well said. My interactions with Ray were very limited. I know I got in contact with him for a story I worked on a few years ago, but some of the qualities you described in him, being welcoming and personable, those very much showed out in our conversation for the story I was working on. And I wish I would have had the opportunity to actually, I might have had a very brief encounter with him in person now that I think about it. But yeah, it would have been cool to have had more of those interactions with him. But to know that for the majority, you can't speak for everyone, but it seems like throughout most of the hockey world, a lot of those interactions with Ray were at least positive, and just everyone just had that respect for him. It just speaks to his legacy, and I think that's great for him.
Well, and I should add too that he died after an illness here, and he chose to keep that largely quiet. I didn't haven't encountered too many people that were aware that he was sick in the hockey world. I'm sure some people knew, but the point is I think that's part of, I don't want to say part of the story, but it's part of the initial reaction that you're getting Wednesday, is just people going, "Oh my goodness, I had no idea this was even a thing that was possible." I mean, we know on some level it's possible every day for anyone, but I mean, I think it took a lot of people by surprise. And as I say, it would have there wouldn't be anyone in a front office around the league that he wouldn't have touched all 32 teams. Obviously players, agents, parents of players, media people, concession workers. I mean, right from top to bottom, this guy spent literally his whole life working in NHL arenas and around this league. And, that's why when you get the commissioner putting out a statement after your death, I mean, that doesn't happen for just anyone. And I think it's a reflection of Ray and his family. And we should mention too, his 2 sons, Kyle and Chris, both work as amateur scouts for NHL teams too. So they're third generation Sheros already, working in the hockey world. Their grandfather, Fred, and their dad, Ray, both have their names on the Stanley Cup. So, this is a family with deep, deep ties throughout the industry.
And what can you say about your relationship with Greg Millen?
It's a little more personal for me with Greg, just because, we worked together at Sportsnet, and there was a time there when I was, working on all the Leafs regional broadcasts, and as was Greg, he was the analyst. I had a much smaller part to, doing hits during the intermissions, but, we were traveling to the same cities at the same time, attending the same games around the team a lot over multiple years. And, I felt I got to know him as you would a colleague in maybe a deeper way, obviously a little bit personally too. And, Greg was a funny guy. I mean, he really liked to, he didn't mind stirring it up, I'll say. Especially, he was around the Leafs. The era what I'm talking about is kind of when they were emerging just from that, their deep slumber of not making the playoffs. They had, fallen kind of, had the lottery luck they did with Matthews. And so it's kind of in those years just when they were building up. And, there's in a big hockey city or any media market, there's going to be little stories that flare up and become sort of mini controversies. And he used to like to take the piss out of us reporters for the way we might be covering a story, or maybe if we got on a certain player, he felt too much or whatever. I mean, it was always he was commenting on our commentary in a way that was pretty funny. But, the thing about that is you always knew he cared. Like it was never, I want to sort of tell the story the right way, because it was kind of always in a joking but serious way. And the one thing I'll say, Greg played, more than 600 NHL games as a goaltender, was in the league for 14 seasons. But by the time I really got to know him, he was already 15 years into a broadcast career. I mean, but he still had that player in him. Like that's what I always felt. Like I sort of felt that sometimes at the heart of what you might call the ribbing or whatever was he still saw the game or saw the business of the NHL from a player's eyes. And he was, at times, I think, trying to direct not just me, but some of the other writers that were around the Leafs at that time in a certain way, because he maybe didn't appreciate the way we were handling certain players or situations. So, that's the first thing that comes to mind. And then, I'll tell a personal story that I shared in the column I wrote about him. But, 10 years ago when my mom got sick, it was an unexpected illness at that time. And, I stepped away. Literally, I actually got a phone call. I was covering a Leafs game to say that she'd been taken to hospital, and I left that game. And then I wasn't on the beat for the next 2.5 months. And she ultimately died of brain cancer. And so the point being in sharing that is that I sort of just disappeared one day from the beat, from my colleagues' perspective, and was obviously busy at that time helping my family manage that situation. And when my mom actually had her funeral, it was on the Friday of the All-Star weekend, the All-Star game in Nashville. And so a lot of people that I worked with didn't end up being able to make the funeral because, they were traveling to Nashville or already there, what have you. And at the morning of her funeral, who walks through the doors but Greg Millen? I mean, I would say one of the last people I would have expected to see in that moment, not because I didn't think he cared about me, but, he didn't know my family, he'd never met my mother. And to my recollection anyway, I don't think he and I had even really spoken a whole lot while she was sick. So it's almost just the last sort of guy you expect to come through. But he made the drive down to my hometown and paid his respects to my family. And, I know that's something for sure my dad and I really both, really appreciated. I'm not to say my siblings didn't, I don't know if they were thinking of it that day. Obviously, when you go through something like that, it's a bit of a blur, but it always stuck with me. I mean, unless you've been through it yourself, it might seem like, oh, what's the big deal? But sometimes it's, sometimes something random like that, it just hits you in a certain way and makes you feel, I guess, loved and appreciated, makes you feel part of something bigger than yourself at a time when you're obviously in a lot of pain. And I just really appreciate that about Greg. I'm sure I thanked him that day. We never talked about it afterwards. Unfortunately, I hope he knows, or hope he knew how much what might look like a small gesture meant to me and my family. And, it's something even my dad and I were both texting about right away. So, I think it says a lot about the kind of person he was. The way I framed it in my story is he was the sort of guy that could make you feel like family, even when, I don't want to overstate it. Him and I weren't best friends. I wasn't going over to his house. I've never met his family. But I think he just had a certain touch with people. And sometimes that touch could be delivered with the sharp wit and taking the piss out of you, but it could also, in that moment where, one of the toughest moments of my entire life, he was there in a different way. And so, I look back, the last time we texted, we were saying Merry Christmas to each other. And he had actually reached out to me. And then I said that I missed having his Leafs observations, which I didn't mean just on the broadcast. I kind of meant seeing him every morning at the morning skate and hearing what he thought of my last column or what have you. And then he said, I missed the group too, but I've got a great family in Calgary that I'm working with now too, because he was covering the Flames broadcast. And I just thought it was fitting. He referred to his colleagues in that again, throwaway text, but he was calling them like family. Cause I do think that's the way he treated people. And that's why you saw the reaction he did to his death. I mean, super sad. I mean, there was no way to know it was coming. He worked the game last week on Sportsnet Flames broadcast. So, very tragic that his life ended so abruptly. But he loved the game, obviously, to be involved in it as long as he was. And he had the broadcast seat of all broadcast seats, Julian. And I realize I'm going on for a long time here.
Go ahead.
But he was sitting beside Bob Cole for many, many years on Hockey Night in Canada's broadcasts, including the last one. He played all that time in the league. Do you know what I really appreciate about Greg is he wasn't one of those people that was living his life in reverse. Like, even though he was covering those games because he played in the league, like, he did tell stories and he had funny observations about things that happened. Like, don't get me wrong, but I felt like he was always also, like, he went and got a master's degree in leadership in his 50s. He was working for outside companies. He was doing some teaching on the side. He spoke a lot of his family and his kids. And like, I felt like he was someone, it's not like he had this time of glory in the NHL and he was just riding off it for another 30 years. Like, I felt like he had a lot of outside interests. He liked to talk about those things, at least with me and the people I was around, especially when I was spending a lot of time with him. And that's kind of what makes me saddest in a way, is that he was looking ahead. And, unfortunately, none of us know how long we have. I mean, it's just a reality. And I don't mean to be glib about that, but I feel like he lived his life to the fullest, but it seems a little unfair to me that he's not still with us and that we're even having this discussion.
Again, well said with Greg. When I was in Calgary, the 2 years I was there, it was really fun seeing him in the locker room. And, not to say that we ever became close friends, but it did get to a point where there was some ribbing back and forth between both of us. And just, I like, as a guy who's new into a market, doesn't know everybody, having that dynamic with someone in there and eventually with other people, I mean, that helped me fit in, I think, personally. So I will always treasure that little bit of time with Greg, or G-Reg, as I would call him. He's just like, I like seeing Greg, man. And to your point about how he definitely had that kind of that wit about him, and he'd crack all these jokes, but I think underneath, like, he was like the nicest. He could be a really nice guy. I keep thinking of when I was there in Calgary, there was a day the Lightning were in town, and I was trying to talk to Nikita Kucherov for a story, and Greg needed him, and I just kind of let Greg do his thing. I was kind of hovering around, and Greg needed him just for a couple seconds. Yeah. And not too long after that, like, Greg called me and it was like, "Hey, I'm sorry. Like, I just wanted to let you know that, like, it wasn't anything personal. Like, I just needed to talk to him because I've known him for all these years and kept track and all that." Like, I don't expect anyone to do that. Like, anyone in the room, like, you go about your business, you talk to your guy. If you don't get him, you don't get him. It is what it is. But the fact that Greg did that just told me ultimately he was a guy of good character. And, even if he could show that he's a guy who does take the piss, this is a guy I think at the end of the day was good natured and just was a good person underneath. So I have nothing but good things to say about Greg. And just like everyone else, I was really sad to hear that he was gone. And you mentioned the family aspect to it too, with those Sportsnet broadcasts, like him and Rick Ball and Ryan Leslie over there in Calgary. I know Rick Ball's in Chicago now, but yeah, he definitely loved working alongside those guys and experiencing everything working with Sportsnet. So to hear about his passing was very sad and very tragic.
You know what else he loved? He loved poking a small hole in a paper coffee cup in the press box. And
yeah, I heard about this.
Oh, man, he did it for years. Like, I'm not saying it was every game or anything like that, but it was his old standby prank was to poke the smallest imperceptible hole in a coffee cup and then watch from a safe distance as a reporter or a scout or someone who worked for the league, filled the cup and then was like dealing with this leaking coffee cup, which I realize is very but it was perfectly him. It was like something he did all the time. And you knew when Greg was around because there'd be spilled coffee somewhere entirely because he's poking holes in those cups and laughing. And, I feel like he's one of those guys. If he wasn't needling you, he didn't love you in a sense. Like it was a way of, first of all, the seasons, it can get long, it was a way of bringing a certain levity to the air some days, when things were heavy or who knows, weather was crappy. It was game 52 or, whatever it could be. It just, I feel like those are all the kind of tricks of the trade that anyone who's lived through so many of those seasons picks up to just sort of, keep things light around the teammates. So, really was kind of that sort of guy, was comfortable being the prankster, was comfortable telling a story. Lots of laughs wherever Greg was, usually him laughing at you. But sometimes, laughing at whoever's trying to pour their coffee and is now seeing the cup disintegrate in their hands.
If you haven't done so already, please read Chris Johnston's articles on Ray Shero and Greg Millen in the last few days. Very well done. Great portraits of two great men we lost in the NHL community this week. They will both be missed. We obviously pass on our condolences here at the CJ Show to their families and their loved ones. Again, CJ, great job on your writing with those two. Bit of a tough transition, but we do have some other topics to get to. One big story popping out of Montreal. Ivan Demidov signing his entry-level contract with the Montreal Canadiens. This story is very interesting, Siege. It looked as if he wasn't going to show up to the Montreal Canadiens this year. At one point, management was expecting that maybe it would be next year for Ivan Demidov. All of a sudden, fans in Montreal, at least they were this morning, at least Wednesday morning, I should say, they were trying to track his flight and trying to figure out when he'd be in Montreal. And they're all trying to figure out when he's going to make his debut. I got a text from a buddy of mine who works for a sports apparel store, and he texted me a photo of a guy who already bought an Ivan Demidov jersey wearing 93 on it. There's a lot with this guy, and a lot of fans in Montreal are particularly excited over this player. Before we get into why fans are excited, how did we get to this point?
Well, the way that the contracts work in the KHL is the player would be under contract through the end of May. And so just in straightforward terms, how we got to this point is SK St. Petersburg was willing to release Demidov from his contract early, which allows him to sign his entry-level deal, which allows Montreal to bring him over now. And the rules allow the Canadiens to play him. As for when we see him play, it seems like Monday might be the most likely time you'll see him play. The Canadiens play Chicago that night. That's not written in stone, in large part because there's multiple matters. There's physically getting him to North America. There's securing all the work visas and permits that are required. And then, there's the hockey side of it, which is just introducing him to the team environment, seeing him in a practice. Don't get me wrong, they're going to let him play, but I think they want to make sure that his legs are under him, that he's ready to go and all those sorts of things. So, it's a bit of a fluid time frame, but, it's a pretty exciting time to be a Canadiens fan. And I think with good reasons, not just because of him. I think he represents something. I mean, sure, we could go through, is he going to be Kirill Kaprizov or that level of good? I mean, it's very possible based on what you've seen through him at age 19. But I think if you're a Canadiens fan, he represents the true turning of the worm here a little bit. I mean, the organization, I know there was the COVID run, in the playoffs, but we'll leave that aside just because times were so weird. There's no fans in the building. I mean, it's been a long sort of turnaround for the Canadiens to get back to being, what I'd call a team that's moving in the right direction, but it's beyond hope. Like you're seeing actual results, right? You're seeing them win all these games and get to the point where they're basically mathematically nearly assured of making the playoffs as of this time. And now you've got this special talent coming over and obviously the fans of that team are so passionate. They've been following his highlights all year long. I mean, he more than held his own against men this past season in Russia. Was the 5th overall pick last June, but might have gone even higher Perhaps if there was even more certainty about when he might come over and all those things. It's a bit of an uncertain time in the world geopolitically, obviously with Russia. I mean, some of this is a little bigger than just sports in terms of being able to know how it would go. But, the management seems to have really formed a connection with this kid. They got all the, they secured everything they need to secure to get him out of Russia now. And I mean, it's found money at this point in time, right? I mean, you turn him loose. I don't know what he's going to be in the short term, nor do I know what he's going to be in the long term. But I would say over the long term, you're probably going to see his talent rise to the occasion. But who knows when you throw him into a game this late in the season with how he's going to react, how he's going to play. Will he stay in the lineup? Will he play all playoffs long? I mean, who knows? But the beauty is, if you're a Canadiens fan, now you get to see it with your own eyes. This isn't just YouTube footage that you're watching, and he's wearing your team's colors. So, I mean, that's where all the enthusiasm comes from, I think. I mean, that marketplace. I'm sure a lot of your friends. I mean, I've got a nephew who we were in a big family chat. Like, it's the kind of family chat where you make like Easter plans. Like, it's not a lot of ribbing. It's almost like formal, right? It's all the parents and grandparents and whatever. And my nephew, who's a fan of the Canadiens, literally for the first time I think I've ever seen him post in the chat, because he's not usually the one making the Easter plans. He just shows up whenever the time's agreed to. It said he's going to book his trip to Montreal for June now that Demidov had signed. Like, he literally, the minute it came out, he had posted an article, with that news and was sharing his excitement. So I think that captures what people feel is, I actually said to my nephew, my response was, I hope you bought a refundable ticket, because I don't want to get too far ahead of yourself. But I do appreciate the enthusiasm. And I think, it's pretty cool time for Canadiens fans all around.
Like, for Canadiens fans right now, you're looking at the team and Ivan joins a roster that already has Cole Caulfield, that already has Nick Suzuki, Juraj Slafkovsky, and Lane Hudson. He looks like he's going to win the Calder this year. And you're wondering if Jacob Fowler is going to do well in net. You've already got Jakub Dobiš in the fold as well, too. All these prospects and young players coming together. If you're a Canadiens fan right now, I don't know how you're not excited about this team. I find it really funny to see that there were fans who were actively trying to figure out when Ivan would land in Montreal, flying from Russia at some point this week. Like, this is excitement on a level that I'm not sure I've seen out of Canadiens fans, and I can understand why. I mean, the prospect base I mentioned, but this is a franchise that has been void of superstar talent for quite some time. Like, when Nick Suzuki hit the 80-point mark a couple of days ago, I think I mentioned in the last episode, that was like the last time that happened was Alex Kovalev in the mid-2000s. And if you look through the DNA of the Montreal Canadiens, the best players to have ever come through the history, the flair, the skill, the talent, that has always been a part of the Montreal Canadiens going back the 50s, 60s, whatever era you want to go to. That has always been a part of their DNA. And I think a lot of fans pin a lot of hopes on the core that's in place, and particularly on Ivan Demidov, particularly with the abilities he's shown playing in Russia and what he could contribute to this team. It remains to be seen if that will all pan out for the Montreal Canadiens. This could all blow up in their face, but this could also not. And if it doesn't, we're talking about one of the more intriguing teams of the Atlantic Division for the next how many years? Like, this is a fascinating story with this player and how Ken Hughes has been able to build this team.
Well, and look, the Laval Rocket are the top record in the American Hockey League right now, too. So, this is what happens when you rebuild as long as they did. They've obviously been selling players over multiple deadlines. I think they've done a nice job with how they've navigated that. Probably best encapsulated by getting a first-round pick to take Sean Monahan and then trading him away for a second first-round pick. But obviously a series of moves and the scouting staff is doing its job. So, look, a lot of things are coming together. I would say, though, this is the blissful fun time. So I really do mean this from the sincerest part of my being. This is the fun time because everything feels possible and the real world hasn't hit yet. The real world will be here in a couple of years. Like part of this deal is that by signing now, Demidov burns an entry-level year right away. So, he's going to need a new contract in 2 seasons' time. Obviously, there'll be other contract situations. There's going to be decisions. There'll be expectations, I guess, is what I'm getting at, that come with this excitement. But right now, there's no expectations for this really brief moment in time. So this is the most beautiful time to be a fan of this team because, whatever happens, I think you'll be content. You can literally just enjoy the games for what they are. Even the way the Canadiens have been winning this last month, I mean, full credit to them, but there's been a lot of high wire act stuff coming back in the third period. I mean, again, it's charming and beautiful, but they're not dominating anyone at this point, right? So, I really just say this not to rain on the parade, but more to be like, this is what makes it so cool. And that's why it'll be great, when Demidov makes his debut and to see what he can do again, whether it's amazing or somewhere in the middle, or even if he struggles a little bit. I still think it's going to be great to see him in the flesh for the fans of the team. And then, he'll be a full-time member of the Canadiens starting next season when they're going to arrive to training camp with more expectations than they've had in a long time.
It's funny hearing you say rebuild as long as they have. Long time. We're really talking about just 3 years. Like 2021-22, the bottom fell out. And then they got in Martin St. Louis and Kent Hughes and started selling some assets. And got the number 1 overall pick. And then 23.
Well, where were they before that, though? My memory's a little.
So
let's remove the cup run because it was such a weird time. Like, I don't even think they would have made the playoffs that year. Like, it was the 2014 thing. Like, it's just a weird. But what happened to the years immediately preceding that?
So, we're talking about a team that was not ready to do any of the rebuilding that they did in 2021-2022. Carey Price was still healthy. Marc Bergevin was still in charge of the Montreal Canadiens, and he very much was trying to build a team that could try to get to the playoffs as best as they could, just off the fact that they had Carey Price and whatever pieces in front of them. You could say this team kind of, I don't know if toiled is the right word, but they were a little bit of a no man's land, but they just randomly got success at different points. I don't think necessarily because they had built these good teams, but really because they had strong goaltending and key moments here and there. Of course, they had PK Subban and Max Pacioretty through some of those mid 2010s teams. But when we look back at the rebuild of the Montreal Canadiens, we're not talking like what the Ottawa Senators have gone through the last 8 years. We're not talking about what the Buffalo Sabres have gone through, what's going on in year 14 of that now. It's a much different situation. I think you're right. In the 2021 year, being as it was, I don't know if that team makes the playoffs, if it was a regular season.
Pretty sure they were way out of it. It's only because of the COVID conditions. And again, I'm not faulting them for that. But they won the games they had to win in that playoffs, but it wasn't like a year. That was a fun 2 months for the fans. Right. But it wasn't a fun whole season. Like, no part of you thought this was a cup team. Frankly, that was unfortunately what was left of the health of Shea Weber and Carey Price, dragging those guys through. And then obviously they brought in Caulfield and Suzuki, were young players that gave them a bit of a jolt. But that was the last vestiges of whatever the previous era was, finding success under the right conditions. But it wasn't a satisfying season, I would say, if you're a fan.
No, I think I'll say this. I think if you're a fan of that team, you're just going for the ride at that point. And with everything that was going on outside of the rink with COVID, being under a curfew, it was all out of nowhere for so many people in that city. And the fact that they were able to get a cup final appearance out of that, again, through the Canadian division circumstances, a lot of those fans will take it. But you're right. That year, the year before, I know for sure, when COVID paused, they were not in a playoff position. That might have been the year they had 2 8-game winless streaks in 2019, 2020. Yeah, they were trending downward for sure. But now with the core they've assembled, at least on paper, they look like they're trending upward. And there's a lot of reasons to be excited around this team right now, and they pin a lot of those hopes on Demidov, who, another part of this too is the fact that he gets drafted where he's drafted, and Celine Dion announces the pick and everything. And that comes after the Canadiens pass on Matvei Michkov and draft David Reinbacher too. Like there's a whole other element to that aspect as well, with pinning the hopes on Ivan Demidov to be the guy after they don't pick a guy that they all wanted in Matvei Michkov.
Fair. I mean, that's how the fans, I get it. I mean, the other thing I should mention on Demidov, he's got 525,000 reasons to win the Conn Smythe Trophy this year because he got that.
Oh, I was going to get to that. I was going to get to that
unique bonus in his contract. And so, the bonus itself is more about setting him up to have larger bonus potential in the next 2 seasons. But I like the idea that he's got a little extra financial incentive to try and go win the Conn Smythe. Now, I don't know, he's thousands to 1 odds on that, but it's happened before. Ken Dryden won the Conn Smythe Trophy in 1971 before winning the Rookie of the Year in 1972. So if he can match that, he's going to be, I'm sure he'll be a happy man for more reason than one, but his accountant will be happy too.
Absolutely. A lot to dissect with that story. But yes, there are so many different reasons why people in Montreal are very happy. I know my friend Marco D'Amico who reported on the story. I think he got it out just before anybody, just before that announcement came out from SK St. Petersburg. He was excited about reporting on that story too. Like, there's a lot of people back home in Montreal who are very amped about this, and we'll just have to see how it plays out with Ivan Demidov with the Montreal Canadiens. Of course, not the only young player to join his NHL team this week. Very curious about how this discussion will go. Zayne Parekh, called up by the Calgary Flames. The Flames still have an outside chance of making the playoffs. It seems as if I saw a lot of what Eric Francis has been posting about Zayne the last couple of days. The expectation is that he's probably not going to get in until maybe the Flames are officially out of it. But I've seen a lot of fans say that, hey, like, this regime is supposed to be playing young players. Isn't this an opportunity for him to be playing? What do you think of Zayne and what he's able to bring with his abilities and playing on this Flames team? And do you think he should get a shot of playing meaningful games as the Flames try to make the playoffs?
Well, here's how the Flames themselves are viewing it. They see this as an opportunity, of course, for him to get the taste of NHL life, to be around the team. He's just spent a year ripping up the Ontario Hockey League. He ripped up the Ontario Hockey League last year in Saginaw, more than 200 points across his last 2 seasons combined as a defenseman, just otherworldly totals. But, they are mathematically still knocking at the door. And so, I think the feeling right now is that he's not going to play while they're mathematically still in it. But I'm going to add an important caveat here. It's a coach's call ultimately. This will be Ryan Huska's decision about who he wants to send out for each given game. And so it's not as though there's like a directive that's come down and said he can't play at all if we still are in the playoff race. But I think, of course, they want to keep expectations reasonable. I think you owe a certain amount to the players that have helped get you to this point through 76, 77 games. So you'd be taking someone out of the lineup, unless there's an injury, of course, to put Parekh in. And I think that there's just maybe concern about how ready he might be for that moment. And so, this is a day-by-day situation, I think. There's no downside in any way, shape, or form for the player himself. He's going to get to be in the NHL environment, be around the team. He gets paid actual dollars as an NHL player until the end of the regular season. Like any way you slice this, it's great for him. But when he gets in, I think is still a little bit of a mystery. I'm not expecting it to come while they're still fighting for their playoff lives. But, maybe when they get him in practice and, see the performance of some other players. I mean, I think that you have to at least leave open a small percentage chance that changes, that approach shifts. And, one thing I'll add, Julian, is the Flames played Colorado in the playoffs the year that Cale Makar went right into the Avalanche lineup. And so they got a firsthand look at how Makar could shift things in that moment. Now, in that time, Makar was coming out of the NCAA. He was an older player. He had some maybe tailwinds, I guess, at his back to make that a successful union. But I mean, it's at least going to be in the back of the Flames' minds that, hey, could he be an X factor? The way it probably is for some of those fans that you're seeing who want Parekh to play. And so where does that leave us? I don't think he's playing right this second, but let's just go day by day and see how things evolve. I mean, Calgary's got a big game Friday, against the Minnesota Wild, head to head, the team they're trying to chase down for their wild card spot. And so, where do things stand heading into that game? Where do they stand coming out of that game? I think it's, the decision will literally be made depending on all the circumstances at play here. But, probably the bigger conversation long term is, where does Parekh play next year? Because he's one of those guys caught in between in that he can't go to the American Hockey League. So he's either got to be on the NHL roster or go back to junior. I think that they're going to want to give him a good long look next season. And as for what happens this season, this is a good reason if you're a Flames fan to be tuning into the games because, maybe, just maybe, while the organization is trying to be cautious, I think they're trying to consider the big picture. They don't want to put too much on his shoulders. Maybe there's something that comes along where Ryan Huska, or the member of the coaching staff, feels they see something and want to turn them loose. I mean, that'll be pretty exciting if it happens.
CJ, I find this debate fascinating with whether or not Zayne should play for the Flames or not. On one end, I look at that lineup and I wonder, where do you put him? You're putting him on a third pairing, I guess, because McKenzie Weegar's on the top pairing on the right side. Rasmus Andersson has his own pairing. So that's two already. Are you comfortable putting him on a third pairing with Jake Bean and you're taking out Braden Pahal out of that right side? I wonder about that. Also, the Flames, they've given chances to younger players, and I know they're a little bit older, but Dustin Wolf had the run in the AHL, but he's proven to be their guy. Matthew Coronado, they tried a little bit last year. There was some starting and stopping, but he looks pretty solid right now. Maybe putting Zayne into the lineup, maybe putting Zayne Parekh into the lineup could work for them. It could also not. I just find it really fascinating what the potential decision, if I were GM anywhere, if I were the head coach, would be. I used to be firmly on the side that said, you know what, maybe he shouldn't play. Now I have more questions.
Yeah, it's sort of almost like a fortune favors the bold type of argument because you're imagining everything could go great, which it could. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when PK Subban kind of got tossed into the Canadiens lineup and played playoff games right away with very little NHL experience. It's there. I mentioned Makar previously. It's happened and it can be helpful. And look, you look at the way Calgary's getting along here. I mean, they need some offense, and this player obviously has great offensive ability. There's probably some concerns about the defensive side of the puck, about just being thrown into the environment. Forget even tactically. It's almost just like emotionally, is he ready? How is he going to handle that potential, set of circumstances? I think that's what's being kicked around in the coach's room. And I do think it's probably easier to leave him out because there are some unknowns in there that you just, that can't be answered beyond writing his number down on the game sheet and sending him over the boards and just seeing what happens. A little bit of a, can you throw him off the dock and can he swim type of thing. And so, I'm with you. I see both sides of the argument. I'm actually landing though more on the side of this team has gotten to where they are without him. And I think there's some risk in putting him into a game where maybe he gets exposed a little bit. Like maybe he's not quite ready. Maybe he makes a mistake that costs the team a game and helps sort of cost them getting the playoffs. Like, do you want to put that on his shoulders? Now, The flip side is, the one thing is too, though, I should say, we're at a stage in the NHL now, at least, where players like this, I think, are a little better understood. Back in when Erik Karlsson was coming along as a very offensive-minded defenseman who wasn't particularly big when he was younger, he was scratched a lot for Ottawa because there was almost like trying to make him into something he isn't. I think now there's a big enough understanding of how dynamic these kind of players can be, right down the line from Quinn Hughes to Lane Hudson in Montreal to, Makar I think that there is at least a little bit more leeway given to younger players that play in the style that these guys do. But I just don't know in this narrow of a playoff race with this few games left under these circumstances if it's the right time. But I'm with you. It's an interesting question. And for me, I probably tend and I know this is the boring answer, but I probably tend towards leave him out of the lineup for now, and then let's see if you can get in. Now, look at if you win a couple games without him, it's an easy decision in a sense to me. Like, you just keep doing what you're doing, and then if you lose, you're basically going to be eliminated. You've got still a few games to give him some NHL experience.
I tried not to laugh when you said I was old enough to remember when PK Subban stepped into the lineup for the Montreal Canadiens. I don't know why my brain just thought, like, I was old enough for that too.
Yeah, that wasn't really directed at you. I just find that funny.
It was just funny.
Because usually people say that before they reference something that happened a long, long time ago. I actually kind of think it's funny to do it something that's more midterm. And you're like, yeah, wait, we all were old enough to remember that. It wasn't that long ago. What do you want about Johnston?
It was like 50 years ago. Anyway, Ryan Huska and the Flames, that's on them to figure out with Zayne Parekh. We'll see how that plays out for them and their playoff chances towards making the playoffs this year. Anyway, let's talk about a team who knows they'll be in the playoffs this year. It's just a matter of whether or not they'll get their captain back. Gabriel Landeskog, about to embark on an AHL stint with the Colorado Eagles, could be playing in a matter of days. What are you hearing about Gabe Landeskog and his potential return to the Colorado Avalanche?
Well, this is obviously a massive step. I mean, you're talking about a guy who hasn't played a game since the Cup final nearly 3 years ago. He's almost been 3 calendar years between games. And so getting a chance to go on this conditioning loan and testing out his readiness to play in a game situation, obviously at high speed, in a physical environment, I mean, it's huge. And it is a positive sign, clearly, that he's trying to get ready, as we thought he would, to try to be back for the Avalanche by the playoffs. We have to add the important, note here, though. Just because he's playing this game doesn't mean it's a certainty, because the nature of his injury is that if he suffers a reoccurrence of that knee issue he had, he's literally back to square one when it comes to his recovery. I mean, basically, it would all but end in one moment. And so, what I've always understood about his rehab, and I know he's put out a documentary, I haven't had a chance to see it on more of the specifics of what he's dealing with, but from a high level, is that even all the work he's done on his conditioning, all the skating he's done, and now we've seen him upping his drills and everything with the Avalanche, getting in contact and practice, until he plays, you just don't know. And so this is a massive moment for him to at least get a chance to test himself out in, you'd think a game situation. You hope it becomes maybe multiple game situation, because that means his health is a place where he can keep playing. And then, ultimately, obviously, this is the captain of the Colorado Avalanche still, guy very involved in everything they do there, who's trying to get back and play for that team in this postseason. So, it's a huge, exciting moment. It's worthy of all the excitement. It's worthy of producer Drew's off-colored gifts going around. But, I do think that we need to also be mindful of the fact that, it's not a certainty that it's going to work out in a positive manner. And obviously, I think it's fair to say we're all just pulling for Gabe as a guy, real class act who's kind of laid it all out there to try to extend his career, to just even get back and have a chance to play. I mean, the normal questions apply. What can he be? If nothing else, he's certainly going to be a spiritual and emotional lift, I would think, for the Avalanche if he can get back in. But he obviously wants to be a contributor on the ice too. And so we'll get a little bit of a better sense of that when he plays in that AHL game and potentially games, depending on how things go.
Man, rooting for Landeskog to come back. That would just be such a fun story for the Colorado Avalanche. Already a team that has the expectations put upon them. But for them to get their leader back after all that time away, like I don't think it's wrong to say I'm rooting for him to just make as good of a recovery as he can as he's tried the last how many years. And it would be really special to see him come back in time for the playoffs. Well,
can you imagine the pop when he returns to Ball Arena?
Yeah.
In playing a home game. Right now it looks like the Avalanche will open the first round on the road almost for certain. And it's not to say he'll be ready for game one anyway, but, if he gets a chance to return and play a game in Denver, I mean, I think that'll be a special response from the crowd. I think that'll be really like one of those moments that, that maybe get burned in your memory. I mean, I don't want to equate it exactly, but when Saku Koivu returned from a cancer battle to Montreal is what's in my mind is just this crazy ovation that he got at that time. I mean, I don't want to put the pressure on that level, but it could be something like that. It wouldn't surprise you. This is a lifelong in terms of his professional life member of the team. He was the captain that lifted the cup, and he hasn't played since. And now he might come back a little bit against the odds, I think it was getting this late into the third season where he hasn't played. There's a lot of people that were doubting him, but he's clearly making a push to play games again.
Absolutely. One more thing before we wrap up here. The Ottawa Senators getting into the playoffs. Buffalo, their playoff drought I kind of mentioned a little earlier. That looks like that's getting extended. They officially have been eliminated. Just wanted to kind of touch on some of the different playoff scenarios they've been playing out the last little while, and particularly want to stick on Ottawa because that 8-year playoff drought ending for them being back in the playoffs, that's also going to be a very fascinating story.
Yeah, as I read in your piece from Tim Stützle, we've been through some shit here. That's saying something. And you should read Julian's piece on how the Senators got back to the playoffs, because it was a real good, if you've sort of not been following the day-to-day, a good reminder of everything they have been through. And it was some shit. And, it was not a guarantee even this season. There was moments in time, early December, where it looked like it was going to be kind of same old, that they hadn't grown enough or they weren't deep enough or whatever it might be. But, by the end, it sort of was a foregone conclusion that they'd be back. It wasn't really in doubt, I would say, the last week or two here. But, still nice when you get the X beside your team's name. And, it's going to be an interesting playoffs all around. I mean, you got Boston not making it, perhaps the Rangers not making it, teams like Montreal and Ottawa now in. I mean, it's getting shaken up a little bit from what had been a pretty static, especially in the Atlantic Division. You had sort of the top 4 teams they're mixing and matching their order, but always making the playoffs, and the bottom 4 beneath that weren't. And now, that's changed this season. And so, I think it's, the Senators last seen in the postseason in double overtime of Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Final. I remember that night really well. I was actually covering that Senators run at the time for Sportsnet, and was sort of an improbable Cinderella type of feel to it. And they pushed Pittsburgh to the absolute brink. But, everything has changed about the organization essentially since that time. And, I think it had to be now, Julian. You must feel that, covering them. They had to find a way to do this. And it's a huge step forward for that team.
Yeah, just for a lot of those guys, particularly the younger core who have been drafted the last few years, getting opportunities to play regular minutes, becoming stars, they needed something like this. I know with Brady Tkachuk, there's going to be a big spotlight on him, but Tim Stützle, Jake Sanderson, there's some young guys who have been wanting that spotlight for some time. And the fact that they were able to get some veterans around them in guys like Linus Ullmark, David Perron as well. Michael Amadio's been able to chip in too. Claude Giroux obviously has been a solid veteran for those guys as well. They've got some pieces, and I think for a lot of Sens fans who have had to sit through a lot of the controversies of the last how many years and the missed seasons these last 8 years, there's a lot of relief. There's a lot of relief and a lot of happiness, and we'll see how that plays out for them in the coming days when the playoffs eventually begin. Whether or not it begins against the Toronto Maple Leafs, against a team from Florida, we'll see if there's an outside chance it could still be the Capitals, but we have to see how the standings shake out. But I think you already know what matchup CJ and I are rooting for here on the CJ Show if it plays out to that. There could be some in-person shows if it works out to the matchup that we want. I think
curious too, I got to say, because Buffalo obviously now goes to 14 years, matching the longest playoff drought in pro sports. Detroit's, had a long one of their own. I wonder if seeing Montreal and Ottawa in a weird way propels these teams. And I know that might seem like a sort of a strange take, but it's now proven to be possible. And obviously Boston is in a rebuilding type of situation. So I don't think they'll start next season, no matter what this summer brings, where anyone will be predicting their playoff team. We are now starting to truly see what I think has been anticipated for a while is a reordering of the Atlantic, the basically the lines of power. And so, Buffalo's had such a strong finish here. I know sometimes that can be fool's gold at the end of a lost season, but I feel like those teams really shouldn't be too far away. And certainly with one or two good decisions in the offseason and then just another year, it's sort of kind of like what the Senators have done. They just compounded their growth. And, the players you mentioned have gotten better. They make the Allmark deal. Things like that were enough to help get them over the top, made a change of a head coach in Ottawa's case. But, I just wonder if a year from now we're sitting here and I'm not saying all four of them will all get in next year, but if the reordering this does actually help those other teams, just to remind them how close they are to actually being there.
It should at least put a fire under them, because I think it's funny to think of Buffalo, Detroit, and Ottawa, but Montreal technically was a step below in their process. Remember, we were talking earlier about how it's only been a couple of years since the actual rebuilding process began. And you think of how long it's been for Detroit. You think of how long it's been for Buffalo. I know if I'm a fan of either of those markets, I'm a bit embarrassed at the fact that it's taken that long. Whereas for Montreal, if they make it to the playoffs, it'll be at lightning speed comparatively to what those other markets have endured. So I feel like if you're Steve Yzerman or you're Kevin Adams or whoever could be in charge for Buffalo, I think that there needs to be some kind of fire under your ass. I think just because seeing the fact that a team behind you who didn't have to take nearly as much time to get themselves in order has gotten themselves settled. You're right. They're not that far off in both of those markets, but I don't feel too good about getting jumped by a team that was behind me in their process.
Right. Nothing's promised though, right? Montreal and Ottawa start at square one next season, just as nothing was promised to Boston this year. They ended up falling out. Toronto, Florida, Tampa, you got to prove yourself again. I mean, that's the beauty of it. But I do finally feel like something's cracked, that there is, maybe it's open this year. I mean, maybe you might look at the East as open. It just feels like there was for a time there where it just felt like there was a established power lock, whatever you want to call it. And I just feel like that the notion of that has changed. I'm not predicting all the good teams are going to become bad or bad ones become good, but I do think that there's finally a reordering of that grouping and it's sort of a jump ball again, especially once we get to next season.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Siege, I think for Stick Taps, we should be good to go. I know we spent the time at the beginning talking about Ray Shero and Greg Millen, and again, those two will be very sorely missed, not just by us, by the rest of the NHL community. I'm good with them being our Stick Taps unless you have some other Stick Tap you'd like to mention.
Nope, no brainer for me, though. I'll just give mine to Millsy. Greg, was a pleasure, my friend. Godspeed and chapeau. Was a pleasure spending the time we did together. Really admired your work. And thanks for everything, pal.
Absolutely. And I'll extend that to Greg as well and to Ray as well. Thank you so much to everyone who listened or watched our show today. Get your questions in for Ask CJ for our Monday episode. And we'll talk to you all next week. Bye for now.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.